March 15th, 1943, 0400 hours, RAF Tangmere, England. Squadron leader, David Mad Dog. Morrison checks his watch one final time before climbing into the cockpit of his modified Mosquito FB-6. The aircraft looks different from standard Mosquitoes. Strange antennae protrude from its wings. Electronic equipment fills what should be the navigator's compartment. Most peculiar of all, the bomb bay carries no explosives, just more electronics and what appears to be a sophisticated camera system. Morrison's ground crew thinks he's lost his mind. For the third time this month, he's planning to fly directly toward German radar installations, not to bomb them, not to avoid them, but to deliberately trigger them, to announce his presence, to let the enemy know exactly where he is. "You're absolutely mad, sir," his mechanic says, securing the canopy. Flying into radar is like walking into a lion's den ringing a dinner bell. Morrison grins beneath his oxygen mask. Sometimes, Thompson, the best way to catch a lion is to make it think it's caught you. What Morrison knows, and what his ground crew doesn't, is that Britain is losing the invisible war. Since 1940, German radar technology has advanced far beyond British capabilities. Würzburg radar stations track RAF bombers with deadly accuracy, directing night fighters to intercept missions with devastating effectiveness. Bomber command losses are becoming unsustainable. The telecommunications research establishment at Malvern has been working frantically to understand German radar systems, but captured equipment provides only fragments of the puzzle. What they need is real-time intelligence, radar signatures captured while German systems are operating at full capacity, hunting for actual targets. Traditional reconnaissance flights using high-altitude, high-speed aircraft fail because they trigger German operators to change frequencies or reduce power output. The Germans have learned to hide their true capabilities when they suspect surveillance. Morrison's solution seems insane. Fly low, slow, and obvious. Make the Germans think they're hunting easy prey. Let them use their radar at maximum effectiveness while secretly recording everything. The plan requires flying straight into the most dangerous airspace in Europe, alone, with minimal defensive armament, relying entirely on surprise and electronic deception. The intelligence gathered could revolutionize radar countermeasures, potentially saving thousands of bomber crew lives. But first, Morrison has to survive what every pilot considers suicide, deliberately flying into enemy radar coverage at low altitude, in broad daylight, broadcasting his position to every German fighter within 100 miles. As Morrison taxis toward the runway, he knows that if his theory is wrong, he'll be dead within 30 minutes. If he's right, he might just change the course of the war. The problem began revealing itself in the winter of 1942. RAF Bomber Command was hemorrhaging aircraft at an unsustainable rate. Night raids over Germany, which had been costly but manageable in 1941, were becoming slaughter. German night fighters were finding British bombers with uncanny accuracy, appearing out of the darkness at precisely the right altitude, speed, and position for devastating attacks. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Bomber Harris studied the loss reports with growing alarm. The numbers told a story of technological defeat. On the night of November 18th, 1942, a raid against Mannheim lost 31 aircraft out of 272 dispatched, an 11.4% loss rate. At that rate, bomber crews would have virtually no chance of surviving their required 30 mission tours. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. British intelligence knew the Germans were using radar to direct their night fighters, but captured Würzburg equipment from early 1941 suggested relatively primitive capabilities. The reality facing Bomber Command in late 1942 indicated German radar had evolved far beyond British understanding. Night fighters were being guided to intercepts with precision that seemed impossible given known German technology. Dr. Robert Cockburn at the Telecommunications Research Establishment had been tasked with developing radar countermeasures, but his team was working blind. They needed to understand current German radar frequencies, power outputs, scanning patterns, and most critically, how the systems integrated to create what appeared to be an impenetrable defensive network. Previous intelligence-gathering attempts had failed spectacularly. High-altitude reconnaissance flights using modified Spitfires triggered German operators to reduce power or change frequencies, providing useless data. Photo reconnaissance missions captured radar installations, but revealed nothing about their operational characteristics. Captured German equipment was either obsolete or deliberately sabotaged before surrender. The most ambitious attempt involved a covert mission to steal components from a Würzburg installation in occupied France. The mission, designated Operation Biting, succeeded in capturing radar parts in February 1942, but analysis revealed only partial information about systems that were already a year old. German radar technology was advancing faster than British intelligence could track it. Even more frustrating, British radar operators intercepting German communications could hear German controllers directing fighters with extraordinary precision, using terminology and procedures that suggested capabilities far exceeding anything in British arsenals. German night fighter pilots were being guided to targets they couldn't possibly see from distances that should have been impossible. By early 1943, the situation had become desperate. Bomber command losses were approaching 5% per mission average, with some raids losing over 10% of participating aircraft. At these rates, the strategic bombing campaign would collapse within months. British industry couldn't replace aircraft and train crews fast enough to sustain such losses. The solution required understanding exactly how German radar worked under operational conditions, not in captured fragments or peacetime tests, but during actual combat when systems operated at maximum effectiveness. This meant someone had to deliberately provoke German radar operators into revealing their true capabilities while surviving long enough to record the intelligence. Morrison had volunteered for what everyone considered a suicide mission because he understood something his superiors didn't. The Germans' greatest strength was also their greatest vulnerability. Squadron leader. David Morrison was not the type of pilot you'd expect to volunteer for suicide missions. At 28, he was older than most fighter pilots, having joined the RAF as a university graduate with a degree in electrical engineering from Cambridge. While his contemporaries dreamed of aerial combat and glory, Morrison was fascinated by the invisible war being fought with radio waves and electronic signals. His nickname, Mad Dog, came not from reckless flying, but from his obsession with understanding German radar. Morrison would spend hours in the intelligence briefing room studying captured equipment, analyzing radar plots, and developing theories about German detection capabilities that most pilots found incomprehensibly technical. He had flown 47 combat missions, mostly night intruder operations, and had developed an almost supernatural ability to detect when German radar was tracking him. Unlike most pilots who relied on instinct and reflexes, Morrison approached flying like an engineering problem. He understood that radar was not magic but physics, and physics could be analyzed, predicted, and potentially defeated. His logbook contained detailed notes about radar behavior, frequency patterns, and electronic signatures that read more like a scientific journal than a pilot's record. Morrison's reputation as an eccentric was cemented during a mission over occupied Holland in December 1942. Instead of avoiding German radar coverage, he had deliberately flown through it, noting how different installations handed off tracking responsibility, how the coverage patterns overlapped, and where potential gaps existed. His detailed report had impressed intelligence officers, but horrified his squadron commander. When Morrison presented his radical reconnaissance proposal to Group Captain James Wheeler in February 1943, the response was immediate and emphatic rejection. Absolutely not, Morrison. You're suggesting we send one of our most experienced pilots on what amounts to an elaborate suicide mission, flying deliberately into radar coverage at low altitude, in daylight. It's madness. Morrison had prepared for this reaction. He spread reconnaissance photographs across Wheeler's desk, pointing to German radar installations along the French coast. "Sir, these Würzburg stations are directing night fighters with accuracy that shouldn't be possible given their known capabilities. They're using techniques we don't understand, frequencies we haven't mapped, and integration methods we can't counter. Every night, we're sending bombers into coverage they can see perfectly while we're flying blind." Wheeler studied the photographs but remained unconvinced. But the telecommunications research establishment has people working on this problem, scientists and engineers, not pilots who think they can solve electronic warfare with flying stunts. "The TRE is working with outdated information," Morrison insisted. "They'd need real-time intelligence. They need to see these systems operating at full capacity under combat conditions when German operators aren't holding back because they suspect surveillance. And you think flying straight into their coverage will somehow make them reveal secrets they've been hiding?" Morrison smiled, the expression that had earned him his nickname. "Sir, I think making them believe they're hunting easy prey will make them show us exactly how good they really are. When a hunter thinks he's stalking a rabbit, he doesn't bother hiding his methods." Wheeler leaned back in his chair, studying Morrison's eager face. "Even if your theory has merit, which I doubt, the operational risks are unacceptable. We can't authorize what amounts to a training exercise for German radar operators using one of our most experienced pilots as bait." The meeting ended with Morrison's proposal officially denied, and a direct order not to pursue unauthorized reconnaissance flights. Wheeler's final words were unambiguous. "Drop this nonsense, Morrison. That's an order." Morrison saluted properly and left Wheeler's office with apparent compliance. But as he walked back to his quarters, his mind was already working on an alternative approach. Sometimes, as he'd learned from studying German radar, the most direct path wasn't through official channels. 3 days after Wheeler's rejection, Morrison found himself in an unauthorized meeting with Dr. Robert Cockburn at a pub outside Malvern. Cockburn, head of radar countermeasures at the Telecommunications Research Establishment, had heard rumors about Morrison's reconnaissance proposal through intelligence channels and was intrigued enough to arrange a clandestine discussion. "Your squadron commander was right about one thing," Cockburn said, studying Morrison over his pint. "And what you're proposing is extremely dangerous, but he's wrong about everything else. We desperately need the intelligence you could gather." Morrison leaned forward eagerly. "You understand the problem, then? The Germans are using their radar far more effectively than our captured equipment suggests they should be able to." "Precisely. We're fighting with 1941 understanding against 1943 technology. Every countermeasure we develop is obsolete before we deploy it because we don't know what we're countering." Cockburn pulled out a notebook filled with technical diagrams. "Well, but your plan, as proposed, has fatal flaws, such as you'll be detected long before you reach optimal recording range. German radar coverage overlaps specifically to prevent exactly what you're attempting. They'll vector fighters to intercept you before you can gather useful intelligence." Morrison had anticipated this objection. That's why the approach has to be counterintuitive. Instead of trying to avoid detection, we announce our presence early and make them believe we're exactly what we appear to be, a lost reconnaissance aircraft, possibly damaged, flying predictably and defensively. Cockburn's eyebrows rose. "Electronic deception. More than that. Behavioral deception. German operators have learned to recognize surveillance attempts because they're conducted by aircraft trying to avoid being tracked. What if we did the opposite? Fly like we're already compromised. Already lost, already desperate. Might work for initial, but you'd still need to survive long enough to record meaningful data. German fighters over their own territory, with ground control guidance, against a single aircraft." Cockburn shook his head. "What if it wasn't a single air? What if it was a single aircraft that appeared to be something else entirely?" Over the next 2 hours, Morrison outlined a plan that was part engineering, part psychology, and part pure audacity. The modified Mosquito would carry electronic equipment capable of recording German radar signatures in extraordinary detail, but it would also carry equipment designed to confuse German identification procedures. The aircraft would approach German airspace broadcasting false radio chatter, suggesting it was a damaged bomber attempting to reach neutral territory. Electronic countermeasures would create radar signatures consistent with a larger, slower aircraft. The flight path would be erratic but predictable, suggesting navigation problems rather than deliberate reconnaissance. Most critically, the mission would be timed to coincide with actual bomber command operations, allowing Morrison's aircraft to blend with legitimate returns until the last possible moment. The Germans will think they're tracking a straggler from a main raid, Morrison explained. Something wounded, off course, and vulnerable. They'll use their best capabilities to ensure a quick kill, and will record everything. Cockburn was quiet for several minutes, sketching calculations in his notebook. Finally, he looked up. The electronic deception is feasible. We could modify a Mosquito with the necessary recording equipment and signature generators within 2 weeks, but you'd still need official authorization. Would I? Morrison asked quietly. Morrison, what you're suggesting? I'm suggesting that if a pilot happened to encounter unusual radar activity during a routine training flight, and if that pilot happened to be carrying recording equipment for unrelated tests, and if intelligence happened to analyze the resulting data, well, accidents happen in wartime. Cockburn closed his notebook slowly. I never had this conversation. What conversation? Morrison replied. 3 days later, Morrison requested permission for extended navigation training flights in a modified Mosquito equipped with experimental communication equipment. His request was approved by a distracted operations officer who assumed it was routine pilot certification. The equipment Dr. Cockburn delivered was far from routine. Hidden beneath standard panels were the most sophisticated radar recording devices the TRE had ever built. Morrison's first training flight on March 8, 1943, was a disaster that nearly exposed the entire operation. Flying over the English Channel at 8,000 feet, testing his modified Mosquito's electronic systems, Morrison triggered an identification challenge from RAF radar stations that he couldn't properly answer without revealing his deception equipment. 2 Spitfires from 611 Squadron were scrambled to intercept what appeared to be an unidentified aircraft broadcasting confusing radar signatures. Morrison found himself in the humiliating position of being chased by his own side while trying to explain over radio why his aircraft was generating electronic signatures consistent with a German bomber. Bloodhound Leader, this is Mongoose 27. I'm conducting authorized communication tests. Request you return to base. Mongoose 27, your radar signature shows you as a possible hostile. Reduce speed and follow us to Tangmere immediately. The incident required Morrison to land under escort and spend 3 hours in debriefing with increasingly suspicious intelligence officers. Only Dr. Cockburn's hastily fabricated explanation about experimental navigation aids prevented a full investigation that would have ended the operation before it began. The second test flight on March 10th revealed more fundamental problems. Morrison's electronic deception equipment worked too well. Flying near the French coast, monitoring German radar activity, his modified signatures created such convincing false returns that German controllers ignored his aircraft entirely, apparently believing it was a technical malfunction rather than an actual target. "They're not even tracking me," Morrison reported to Cockburn during their post-flight debrief. The radar operators see the confused signatures and assume it's equipment failure. They're turning their attention to clearer targets. So we need to be deceptive enough to fool identification procedures, but not so deceptive that they ignore us entirely. Cockburn mused. A very narrow window. The third attempt on March 12th nearly killed Morrison when his behavioral deception proved too convincing. Flying erratically to simulate a damaged aircraft, Morrison triggered not just radar tracking but an immediate fighter intercept. 2 Focke-Wulf 190s appeared out of cloud cover at 15,000 feet, diving toward Morrison's position with aggressive intent. Morrison's Mosquito, loaded with recording equipment instead of armament, was defensively helpless. Only the aircraft's superior speed in a dive allowed escape, but the pursuing fighters pressed their attack for over 20 minutes, firing repeatedly and scoring several hits on Morrison's aircraft before he reached British airspace. Landing at Tangmere with holes in his fuselage and a damaged starboard engine, Morrison faced immediate grounding and investigation. His cover story about encountering unexpected enemy activity during routine training satisfied no one, particularly when examination of his aircraft revealed the sophisticated recording equipment. Group Captain Wheeler arrived at Morrison's hospital bed that evening with barely contained fury. "Well, Morrison, I gave you a direct order to abandon this radar reconnaissance nonsense. Not only have you disobeyed, you've endangered valuable equipment and nearly lost an aircraft we can't afford to replace." Morrison, bandaged but unrepentant, tried to explain. "Sir, we're learning things about German radar that—" "You're learning nothing except how to get yourself killed in the most expensive way possible. This operation ends now. The aircraft will be returned to standard configuration, the recording equipment will be removed, and you'll return to normal flight duties immediately." Wheeler's departure left Morrison staring at the ceiling, contemplating failure. 3 attempts had produced no useful intelligence while nearly exposing the operation twice and nearly getting him killed once. The fundamental approach seemed flawed. But that night, analyzing the limited data from his encounters, Morrison realized something crucial. The German radar operators weren't just tracking aircraft, they were trying to understand them. Each time his electronic signatures confused them, they increased power output and changed scanning patterns, trying to resolve the confusion. The solution wasn't to hide from German radar or to fool it completely. The solution was to give it a puzzle interesting enough to investigate, but solvable enough to maintain engagement. Morrison began sketching new deception profiles that would challenge German operators without frustrating them into abandonment. By March 14th, Morrison's unauthorized activities had attracted attention far beyond Group Captain Wheeler's authority. Air Vice Marshal Donald Bennett, commander of the Pathfinder Force, arrived at Tangmere with explicit orders to terminate what he called Morrison's freelance intelligence operation permanently. Squadron leader, Morrison. Bennett's voice carried the authority of absolute command. "Your activities have been reported to Air Ministry. Unauthorized flights over enemy territory, misuse of experimental equipment, and deliberate disobedience of direct orders constitute grounds for court-martial." Morrison stood at attention in Bennett's temporary office, acutely aware that his career was ending. "Sir, the intelligence potential—" "There is no intelligence potential," Bennett interrupted. "There is only a pilot who has decided he knows better than his superiors, better than the professionals at TRE, and better than Air Ministry policy, Doctor. Cockburn has been recalled to Malvern and ordered to cease all cooperation with your schemes." The blow was devastating. Without Cockburn's technical support, Morrison's operation was impossible, but Bennett wasn't finished. "Furthermore, you will be transferred immediately to Transport Command. No more fighters, no more reconnaissance, no more opportunities for individual heroics. You'll spend the rest of this war flying cargo runs to Gibraltar, where your tendency toward unauthorized initiatives will be contained." That afternoon, Morrison cleared his quarters at Tangmere while his modified Mosquito was stripped of recording equipment under armed guard. 3 weeks of preparation, thousands of pounds in specialized electronics, and months of planning were being dismantled by technicians who had no understanding of what they were destroying. But as Morrison packed his belongings, he discovered that Dr. Cockburn had anticipated this outcome. Hidden in Morrison's flight manual was a handwritten note. Equipment relocated to Maintenance Hangar C, Station Tempsford. Ask for Charlie Thompson. Suggest you develop sudden interest in Special Operations Executive training flights. Tempsford was the secret airfield used by SOE for clandestine missions into occupied Europe. If Cockburn had moved the operation there, he was escalating beyond military authority into the murky world of intelligence services where different rules applied. 2 days later, as Morrison prepared to report to Transport Command, he received unexpected orders to report first to Wing Commander Smith at an undisclosed location for special briefing regarding previous technical experience. The orders bore authentic signatures, but originated from no identifiable command authority. Morrison found himself at Tempsford being briefed by a man who introduced himself only as Smith, and who clearly knew everything about Morrison's radar reconnaissance attempts. Squadron Leader, your unauthorized activities have created considerable administrative difficulty. However, they have also attracted interest from organizations with broader operational scope than the RAF. Organizations, sir, let's say that certain people understand the value of your proposed intelligence gathering and are prepared to provide resources unavailable through normal military channels. But such support comes with conditions. Smith's conditions were stark. Morrison would be officially transferred to Transport Command as ordered, but would actually be seconded to SOE for Special Technical Operations. His radar reconnaissance missions would continue, but under Intelligence Service Authority rather than RAF Command. Success would mean commendation and continuation. Failure would mean deniability and abandonment. If you're captured, Squadron Leader, you're conducting unauthorized flights that your superiors knew nothing about. If you're killed, you died in a regrettable training accident. If you succeed, you may have changed the course of the war. Morrison understood he was being offered a choice between official disgrace and unofficial opportunity. Either way, his conventional RAF career was over, but only one option offered the possibility of completing his mission. When do I begin, sir? Smith smiled for the first time. Dr. Cockburn is waiting in Hangar C with your aircraft. Your first operational mission launches tomorrow night. As Morrison walked toward the hangar, he realized he had moved beyond military hierarchy into a world where results mattered more than regulations, where national survival justified individual risks that peacetime would never tolerate. March 15th, 1943, 0600 hours, Hangar C, RAF Tempsford. Dr. Cockburn's modifications to Morrison's Mosquito were extraordinary. Working with resources provided by SOE's technical section, he had created what amounted to a flying electronic intelligence laboratory. The aircraft now carried 3 separate recording systems, each designed to capture different aspects of German radar operation. The primary system records frequency patterns and power outputs, Cockburn explained, pointing to equipment panels. The secondary system captures timing sequences and scanning rhythms. The tertiary system is revolutionary. It records the actual control signals German operators send to their night fighters. Morrison studied the new equipment with professional admiration. You've turned this aircraft into a radar spy. More than that, we've given it the ability to respond intelligently to German radar. Watch this. Cockburn activated a console that immediately began generating complex electronic signals. This system can mimic the radar signature of any Allied aircraft type: bomber, fighter, transport, even specific models. Electronic camouflage, precisely, but more sophisticated than anything previously attempted. The system doesn't just generate false radar returns, it creates entire electronic personalities, flight characteristics, altitude patterns, speed variations, even damage simulation. The breakthrough had come from studying Morrison's failed attempts. Instead of trying to fool German radar completely, Cockburn had developed a system that could tell electronic stories. The modified Mosquito could appear to be a damaged B-17 struggling home, a lost transport looking for navigation assistance, or a reconnaissance aircraft with specific mission profiles. Well, the Germans won't just track you, Cockburn continued. They'll believe they understand you. And when people think they understand something, they reveal how they analyze it. Morrison's first operational flight under SOE authority launched at 2200 hours. His target was the Würzburg installation at Cap Gris-Nez, known to be directing German night fighters against bomber command operations over northern France. Flying at 12,000 feet, Morrison activated his electronic deception systems 50 miles from the French coast. To German radar operators, his single Mosquito appeared to be a damaged American B-24 Liberator, flying slowly and losing altitude gradually. The German response was immediate and illuminating. Morrison's recording equipment captured not just radar tracking signals, but the actual radio communications between German ground controllers and intercepting fighters. For the first time, British intelligence could hear exactly how German radar operators analyzed and prosecuted targets. Achtung! Großer Bomber, Kurs 200, Höhe 3500, Geschwindigkeit 180, scheint beschädigt. Victor 2, Angreifen von rechts hinten. Morrison's German was sufficient to understand the controller's assessment. Large bomber, course 200, altitude 3,500 meters, speed 180 kilometers per hour, appears damaged. Fighter Victor 2 ordered to attack from right rear. But Morrison was flying at 12,000 feet, not 3,500 meters. His electronic deception was convincing German radar that he was flying 8,000 feet lower than his actual position. The approaching fighter would attack empty air, while Morrison recorded the entire engagement sequence from a safe altitude. As the German fighter swept through the airspace where Morrison should have been, German ground control became confused. Victor 2, keine Sichtung. Bestätigen Sie Zielposition. No visual contact. Confirm target position. Morrison's equipment recorded frantic attempts to reacquire the target as German operators increased power output and switched between different radar modes, trying to understand how their target had vanished. In their confusion, they revealed technical capabilities that British intelligence had never suspected. The German radar network wasn't just detecting aircraft, it was automatically calculating intercept vectors, predicting flight paths, and coordinating multiple installations to hand off targets seamlessly. The level of integration and automation far exceeded anything in British systems. But, most importantly, Morrison discovered that German confidence in their technology created predictable vulnerabilities. When their radar told them something specific, they believed it completely, even when that information was electronically fabricated. Flying home with recording equipment full of unprecedented intelligence, Morrison realized they had discovered something far more valuable than German radar capabilities. They had discovered how to manipulate German radar perceptions. The war was about to change fundamentally. March 30th, 1943. The Casablanca Conference had set June 1943 as the deadline for achieving air superiority over Europe, prerequisite for any invasion planning. Bomber command losses in March alone exceeded 300 aircraft, with crews reporting that German night fighters seemed to anticipate every tactical change, every new route, every attempted deception. Morrison's intelligence had revealed why. German radar wasn't just detecting Allied aircraft, it was learning from them. Each mission generated data that German operators analyzed to predict future Allied tactics. The electronic war was being lost not through technical inferiority, but through predictability. Air Chief Marshal Harris summoned Morrison to High Wycombe for an emergency briefing that included representatives from the highest levels of Allied command. Morrison found himself explaining radar countermeasures to men who would decide the fate of millions. Squadron leader, Harris began without preamble. Your intelligence suggests that German radar capabilities exceed our most pessimistic estimates. If accurate, our planned expansion of strategic bombing operations is impossible. We cannot sustain losses at current rates, much less increased operational tempo. Morrison had prepared for this moment. Sir, German radar superiority is real, but it's not insurmountable. Their strength comes from systematic analysis and predictable Allied responses. But systematic analysis creates systematic vulnerabilities. Explain. Morrison spread reconnaissance photographs and radar plots across the briefing table. German operators have learned to recognize specific Allied aircraft types, flight patterns, and tactical procedures. They've created an electronic library of Allied signatures that allows precise identification and optimized interception, making our operations transparent to German radar, observed Air Vice Marshal Saundby. Exactly. But what if we fed false information to that library? What if we made German radar see what we wanted them to see instead of what was actually there? The concept Morrison outlined was revolutionary. Large-scale electronic deception operations designed to systematically mislead German radar analysis. Instead of hiding from German radar, Allied aircraft would broadcast carefully crafted false signatures that would corrupt German intelligence databases. Imagine German operators tracking what appears to be a major bombing raid against Hamburg, Morrison explained. Hundreds of aircraft, perfect formation, predictable route. They vector every available fighter to intercept. But the aircraft they're tracking don't exist. They're electronic phantoms created by a handful of aircraft broadcasting false signatures, while the real bombing raid hits a completely different target, Harris concluded. Or while no bombing raid occurs at all, and German fighters exhaust their fuel-chasing ghosts. The plan required immediate implementation. German radar analysis was becoming more sophisticated weekly. Delay would allow German operators to recognize deception attempts and develop countermeasures, but the technical challenges were staggering. Morrison's single modified Mosquito had proved the concept, but operational effectiveness required dozens of aircraft carrying standardized deception equipment, electronics production, pilot training, and tactical coordination needed to occur simultaneously under absolute secrecy. Squadron leader, Harris studied Morrison intently. If we authorize this operation, you'll be responsible for training pilots in techniques that don't exist, using equipment that hasn't been built, to conduct missions unlike anything previously attempted. Failure will compromise not just strategic bombing operations, but invasion preparations. Morrison understood the weight of responsibility being placed on him. Sir, failure to attempt this operation guarantees strategic bombing failure. German radar advantages are increasing faster than we can counter them through conventional means. Time requirements? 6 weeks to train the first operational squadron.
8 weeks for full deployment. You have 4 weeks, Harris said, and squadron leader, this operation cannot fail. Too much depends on it. As Morrison left High Wycombe that he carried authorization for Operation Moonshine, the largest electronic deception campaign in military history. Success would blind German radar to Allied operations. Failure would alert German intelligence to British capabilities while sacrificing irreplaceable.
The clock was ticking toward D-Day, and Morrison held responsibility for clearing the electronic skies over Europe. April 28, 1943, 2130 hours, RAF Tempsford. Morrison stood before 18 pilots from the newly formed 100 Squadron, men handpicked for Operation Moonshine, not for their flying ability, but for their technical aptitude and ability to maintain absolute secrecy. Their aircraft, modified Mosquitoes and Lancasters equipped with the latest electronic deception systems, represented the culmination of 6 weeks of frantic development. Gentlemen, tonight we find out if electronic warfare can replace brute force, Morrison addressed his pilots. Our target is the entire German night fighter network between Calais and Hamburg. We're going to make them see the largest Allied air raid in history, while the actual aircraft involved could fit in this hangar. The plan was audacious beyond anything previously attempted. 12 aircraft carrying sophisticated electronic equipment would create radar signatures simulating a 300-bomber raid approaching Hamburg. Meanwhile, actual Bomber Command operations would target Düsseldorf, completely outside expected German fighter concentration. Flight Lieutenant Thompson raised his hand. "Sir, if German radar operators realize what we're doing, they'll have learned to defeat every future deception operation," Morrison finished, "which is why this test must be absolutely convincing. We get one chance to prove electronic deception works before German intelligence adapts to counter it." At 2200 hours, Morrison's Phantom Air Fleet began broadcasting their electronic masquerade. From German radar perspective, massive formations were assembling over eastern England, displaying all the characteristics of a maximum-effort bombing raid: radio chatter, carefully scripted and broadcast on frequencies German intelligence monitored, discussed navigation to Hamburg, weather over the target, and bomb loads consistent with a strategic attack. The German response exceeded Morrison's most optimistic projections. Within 30 minutes, night fighter squadrons across occupied Europe were scrambling toward predicted intercept positions. Radar installations from Denmark to Belgium increased power output to maximum levels, attempting to track the massive formation German controllers believed was approaching. Morrison's recording equipment captured everything: radio communications revealing German tactical procedures, radar frequencies previously unknown to British intelligence, and most critically, the systematic way German defences redistributed to counter the Phantom threat. Flying at 15,000 feet above the English Channel, Morrison watched his instruments as German radar tracked formations that existed only as electronic signals. On his communications radio, he could hear increasingly frantic German controllers trying to coordinate intercepts against targets that appeared to be following standard Allied bombing procedures. Achtung alle Einheiten. Großer Verband im Anflug auf Hamburg. Geschätzte Stärke 300 Bomber. Alle verfügbaren Jäger sofort zum Sammelplatz. All units, attention. Large formation approaching Hamburg. Estimated strength 300 bombers. All available fighters to rally point immediately. But the most revealing moment came at 23:47 hours, when German controllers realized their fighters were finding nothing but empty sky. The radio communications Morrison intercepted captured German confusion in real time. "Wo sind die Bomber? Radar zeigt sie hier, aber wir sehen nichts. Where are the bombers? Radar shows them here, but we see nothing." German radar operators, having committed completely to tracking Morrison's electronic phantoms, had no explanation for the absence of actual aircraft. More importantly, they had no immediate countermeasures for the real bombing raid that was simultaneously devastating Düsseldorf with minimal fighter opposition. At 01:30 hours, as Morrison's aircraft returned to Tempsford, preliminary reports indicated complete operational success. Bomber Command losses over Düsseldorf were the lowest in months, while German night fighters had exhausted fuel and ammunition chasing electronic ghosts over Hamburg. But the true validation came 3 days later through ultra-intercepts of German communications. German intelligence was reporting massive equipment failures in their radar network. Unable to explain how 300 aircraft had appeared on radar, triggered maximum defensive response, then vanished without trace. German radar operators were questioning their own equipment rather than suspecting Allied deception. The electronic masquerade had been so convincing that German technical staff were replacing radar components, recalibrating systems, and conducting equipment tests that would degrade defensive effectiveness for weeks. Morrison had proven that electronic deception could achieve what conventional bombing could not: systematic degradation of German defensive capabilities without losing a single Allied aircraft. Operation Moonshine was ready for full operational deployment. The briefing room was filled with the same senior officers who had dismissed Morrison's proposals 2 months earlier. Now they studied operational reports that challenged everything they thought they knew about electronic warfare. Group Captain Wheeler, who had ordered Morrison to abandon his radar reconnaissance, was examining loss statistics with visible amazement. "These numbers can't be accurate," Wheeler muttered. "On Bomber Command, losses have dropped 60% in operations using moonshine support. Either this is statistical anomaly, or Squadron Leader Morrison has revolutionized air warfare," Air Chief Marshal Harris interrupted. "Well, the operational evidence is conclusive. Electronic deception is more effective than any defensive system we've ever deployed." The transformation had been dramatic and immediate. Following the successful Hamburg deception, 100 Squadron had conducted 12 major electronic deception operations, each one more sophisticated than the last. German night fighter effectiveness had collapsed as operators struggled with equipment they no longer trusted and targets that behaved in ways their training couldn't explain. Air Vice Marshal Bennett, who had threatened Morrison with court-martial, now found himself advocating for massive expansion of electronic warfare capabilities. "We need to scale this operation immediately. Every major bombing mission should have moonshine support." Morrison, promoted to wing commander and given command of all electronic deception operations, outlined the strategic implications. "Gentlemen, we've discovered something more valuable than radar superiority. We've learned to make the enemy's technology work against them. German radar is now our ally because German operators trust it completely." The intelligence gathered from moonshine operations had revealed the complete structure of German air defense network. Morrison's teams now understood how German radar installations communicated, how they prioritized targets, and most critically, how they could be systematically misled. "The Germans have created the most sophisticated air defense system in history," Morrison continued. "But sophistication creates vulnerability. The more complex their analysis procedures, the more opportunities we have to feed them false information." Dr. Cockburn presented technical analysis that stunned the assembled officers. German radar operators are no longer questioning electronic anomalies. They've experienced so many equipment failures that they've lost confidence in their ability to distinguish between actual targets and technical problems. The psychological impact was as important as the tactical success. German night fighter pilots, repeatedly vectored to empty sky, were beginning to distrust ground control guidance. Radar operators, unable to explain systematic equipment behavior, were requesting transfers to other duties. The entire German night fighter system was experiencing what intelligence analysts termed electronic neurosis. But the most dramatic validation came from an unexpected source. On May 12th, German radio broadcasts had announced the recall of General Josef Kammhuber, architect of the German night fighter defense system. Intelligence analysis suggested Kammhuber was being blamed for the mysterious collapse of German defensive effectiveness. "We've done more than deceive German radar," Morrison realized during the briefing. "We've convinced German high command that their most successful air defense commander is incompetent." Air Marshal Portal, chief of the air staff, studied Morrison with newfound respect. "Wing commander, your electronic deception operations have achieved what 2 years of strategic bombing could not. Systematic degradation of German defensive capabilities without significant Allied losses. More than that, sir. We've created a template for electronic warfare that will remain relevant long after this conflict ends. Any nation that depends on electronic systems for defense can be vulnerable to systematic deception." The immediate practical impact was authorization for Operation Starkey, the largest electronic deception operation ever planned. Morrison would coordinate phantom air raids involving apparent formations of over 1,000 aircraft, designed to support actual invasion preparations while completely misleading German intelligence about Allied capabilities and intentions. But as Morrison left the Air Ministry that evening, he understood that his real achievement wasn't military. He had demonstrated that in an age of increasing technological sophistication, the human tendency to trust technology completely created vulnerabilities that creative intelligence could exploit. The war was changing from contest of industrial capacity to competition of technological ingenuity. And Morrison had given the Allies their first decisive advantage in that new form of conflict. Wheeler approached Morrison outside the building, extending his hand with genuine contrition. "Wing Commander, I owe you an apology. And perhaps more importantly, I owe you thanks. You've probably saved more Allied lives than any other individual operation of this war." Morrison accepted the handshake. But his mind was already focused on the next challenge, preparing electronic deception for the greatest military operation in history. As Allied forces stormed the beaches of Normandy, Wing Commander Morrison flew his final electronic deception mission over the Pas-de-Calais, leading Operation Taxable, a phantom invasion fleet of electronic signatures that convinced German radar operators that the main Allied assault was occurring 150 miles from the actual landing sites. His modified Mosquito, now veteran of over 40 deception missions, broadcast the radar signatures of an entire invasion fleet while the real landings proceeded with minimal German air opposition. The success of D-Day owed much to Morrison's electronic warfare innovations. German radar, the technology that had once threatened to make Allied operations impossible, had become the instrument of its own deception. Morrison's techniques kept German reserves positioned to defend against invasions that existed only as electronic phantoms. But Morrison understood that his greatest achievement extended far beyond any single military operation. He had demonstrated that in technological warfare, the most sophisticated systems could be turned against themselves through creative application of deception principles. This insight would reshape military thinking for generations. After the war, Morrison remained with the newly formed Royal Air Force Electronic Warfare Division, developing countermeasures against emerging threats. His techniques, refined and expanded, became fundamental to Cold War strategy. The electronic deception principles he pioneered were adapted for radar, communications, and eventually computer systems. Morrison's wartime innovations directly influenced the development of electronic countermeasures that protected Allied aircraft throughout the Cold War. His insight that complex systems could be confused through systematic false input became the foundation for electronic warfare doctrines still used today. The man who had volunteered for what everyone considered a suicide mission lived to see his techniques protect Allied forces in Korea, Vietnam, and conflicts around the world. Electronic warfare, the discipline Morrison essentially created single-handedly, became a standard component of military operations. Morrison retired from the RAF in 1963 as Air Commodore, but continued consulting on electronic warfare developments well into the 1980s. He witnessed the evolution of his deception techniques from simple radar confusion to sophisticated computer network operation, always emphasizing that technological superiority meant nothing without understanding human psychology. In 1995, at age 80, Morrison was asked by a defense technology conference to explain how his wartime innovations remained relevant in an age of satellite navigation and computer-guided weapons. His answer captured the timeless principle he had discovered over the skies of occupied Europe. Technology amplifies human capabilities, but it doesn't eliminate human vulnerability. The more we depend on our systems, the more catastrophic it becomes when those systems lie to us. Any nation that trusts its technology completely has given its enemies the key to defeating it. Today, Morrison's insights are more relevant than ever. Cyber warfare, GPS spoofing, and electronic attack systems all trace their conceptual origins to his realization that sophisticated technology could be turned against itself. Modern military forces study Morrison's techniques not as historical curiosities, but as fundamental principles of electronic warfare. The pilot who deliberately flew into enemy radar to gather intelligence that everyone considered impossible to obtain had discovered something profound. In technological conflict, the greatest vulnerability is often complete confidence in technological superiority. Morrison died in 2001, But his legacy lives on every time electronic countermeasures protect military forces, every time cybersecurity specialists defend against deception attacks, and every time engineers remember that the most sophisticated system is only as reliable as the assumptions built into it. The mad pilot who shocked his superiors by proposing to fly straight into enemy radar had taught the world that sometimes the most direct approach to an impossible problem is to make the impossible work for you instead of against you. His lesson remains as relevant today as it was over the skies of Nazi-occupied Europe. In the age of technology, victory belongs not to those with the best systems, but to those who best understand how to make enemy systems serve their purposes.